My son-in-law's family thought it would be funny to push my daughter into the freezing lake. They laughed as she slipped, hit her head on a rock, and nearly drowned. I screamed for help from the shore, my voice cracking in terror, but they only laughed louder. "Stop being dramatic, she can swim," one of them shouted, before getting into their car and driving away, leaving me in disbelief. When the ambulance arrived and lifted my unconscious daughter onto the stretcher, I dialed my older brother with trembling hands. My voice was barely a whisper. "They're heading home now. Do what you do best." Before we begin, if you enjoy emotional true stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Clara's Stories, like this video, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I always love hearing where my listeners are from. Now, let's begin. The air that day at Vander's Lake House, nestled beside the still waters of Lake Tahoe, carried a strange mix of pine needles, smoke, and something darker. Most people would have said it smelled like nature and weekend barbecues, but to me, it carried the scent of tension and fear, something I could feel deep in my bones. I sat quietly on the porch, a wicker chair creaking beneath me, watching my daughter Lena move gracefully between the table and the bar. She poured aged scotch for her husband, Preston, and his father, Garrett, pretending to laugh at their crude jokes. But I knew that laughter. It was too bright, too forced. The kind of laughter someone uses to hide pain. Even after years of marriage, Lena was still trying to earn their approval. Approval from men who only knew how to take, never how to love. The Vandor estate matched their personalities. Grand, expensive, and completely soulless. The house stood like a fortress of dark wood and glass, overlooking the lake with empty, unfeeling eyes. The lawn was perfect, not a single dandelion daring to grow. Everything was staged, immaculate, cold. Even the sunlight seemed duller there. It didn't warm you, it just reflected off the polished cars parked neatly by the gate. I only ever came to that house for Lena. Every time, she begged softly, "Mom, please come. It means a lot to them." To me. And every time, I went, because deep down, I knew she wasn't doing it for them. She was doing it to keep her dream alive, the dream of having a real, loving family. But as I looked at Garrett's smug grin and Preston's mocking eyes, all I saw was decay under the surface. A beautiful mansion built on rot. That afternoon, they were already drunk. Their forced charm had vanished, replaced by the kind of loud, unfiltered arrogance only alcohol brings. They laughed too loudly, gestured too wildly, and every word they spoke carried one message. They owned this place, this moment, this woman. Garrett's booming voice cut through the air. "Why's our little city girl all bundled up?" Lena froze mid-step. She was wearing jeans and a thick autumn jacket. The wind from the lake was biting that day. "It's just a bit chilly, Mr. Garrett," she said gently, smiling to keep the peace. "Windy," Preston mocked, echoing his father. Back in my day, women weren't afraid of a little cold water. They had some grit. This generation's too soft. A chill ran down my spine, not from the breeze, but from what was coming. The tone in their voices reminded me of a knife slowly being sharpened. "Leave her alone," I said softly but firmly, my voice foreign and shaky in the heavy silence that followed. Preston turned, that familiar spark of cruelty glinting in his eyes. He despised it when I interfered. "Relax, Mrs. Hayes. We're just having some fun, right, honey?" He winked at Lena. "Of course, Mom, everything's fine," she said quickly, her smile trembling. But everything inside me screamed that it wasn't fine. I saw it, the way Garrett and Preston exchanged that look, their secret, unspoken look, the one that said, "Let's see what happens next." Garrett suddenly stood, towering, his shadow stretching long across the deck. "Let's see how tough our girl really is. Preston, help me out." "What are you doing?" I jumped to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. "Garrett, stop it. This isn't funny." But they didn't listen. They never did. Lena yelped as they each grabbed her by the arms. "Preston, Dad, stop, please," she gasped, but they only laughed harder. She tried to play along, still hoping it was a joke. They dragged her toward the pier that jutted out over the cold, black water. I followed helplessly, shouting for them to stop, but to them, I was nothing, just an old woman's voice carried away by the wind. The image of my daughter clung to me like cold mist, the way she once ran to me with a scraped knee, the white ribbons in her hair, the small bouquets she carried with pride. I saw her again at high school graduation, turning under the light in a simple dress that made her eyes shine with everything she believed life would give her. And on her wedding day, when she looked at Preston with a faith so pure, I wanted to shout, "Don't trust the picture they paint for you." But I stayed silent. I stayed silent then, and I stayed silent through the years, thinking my quiet was a gift, a protection, the tax every mother pays to keep her child's fragile happiness alive. The ambulance lights broke that illusion. Medics ran around her body, their movements fast, rehearsed, almost mechanical. Words drifted through the cold air, pulse faint, hypothermia. Possible head injury. A fisherman stood nearby, cap crushed in his hands, unsure if he should speak. I only nodded. He understood and walked away, leaving me with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the reflection of red lights dancing on the lake. In that moment, I felt the old life ending, the one where I was just a quiet mother, just a polite guest at someone else's table. That version of me dissolved right there on the pier. Something heavier took its place. Not rage, but a terrifying clarity. I reached for my phone. My fingers no longer shook with fear. They moved with decision. I scrolled through names that belonged to another era, to people I hadn't needed when I still believed in good manners and small talk. Then I found one, Isaac, a voice from a past I had buried because it frightened me. A man who once exposed a lie so big it ruined him. I had condemned his methods back then, called them ruthless, called him obsessed. Now I understood. Sometimes truth needs that edge. I pressed call. It rang long enough for doubt to creep in. Then his low voice came through. Rough, distant. "Who is this?" "Isaac," I whispered, turning away from the medics so they wouldn't hear. "It's me." Silence. I could almost feel him stand up, his mind already assembling the pieces. He didn't ask what happened. He never wasted words. "I'm listening, Eleanor," he said finally. Across the dark road, the taillights of the Van Doren's car were already fading into the distance. I imagined them driving toward their fortress of glass and stone, music on, laughter easy. They believed the evening was over. They didn't know a storm had already begun to move toward them. Not a storm of vengeance, but of exposure, truth, and consequence. "They're on their way home," I said quietly. "It's time to bring everything to light." I ended the call before he could respond. The decision was complete. There was no going back to the woman who endured quietly. The medics closed the ambulance doors. The siren rose and carried my daughter away into the night. I stood there on the shore, the lake black and still, the reflection of the flashing lights fading like dying stars. For the first time in years, I didn't feel fear. I felt the calm of someone who finally knows what must be done. A cab arrived, smelling faintly of gasoline and air freshener. The driver glanced at me through the mirror, wanting to ask questions, but thinking better of it. I had no answers left for small conversations. The city lights blurred past my window. My mind replayed another scene. The Vandor house, immaculate and cold, welcoming its masters back. I could see them stepping inside, confident in their own untouchable world, never realizing that silence, once broken, can echo louder than any scream. The mother-in-law was always hysterical, a woman of shrill tones and trembling hands who lived for drama. She would wail, cry, and turn every small inconvenience into a stage performance. And as always, Lena would rush to her side, the loyal daughter smoothing every chaos. "Mom, stop," she'd whisper gently. "They didn't mean anything by it. They're just kidding." She had always defended them, always, like someone hypnotized into believing cruelty was just humor dressed in fine clothes. In my mind, I could see them now, Preston leaning lazily against the bar counter, pouring himself another glass of scotch. The ice cubes fell one by one, clinking against the glass with the lonely echo of a beggar's last coin. Garrett, bored and mechanical, turned on the massive plasma screen. Financial news flickered, charts, graphs, serious faces discussing markets and futures. That was their temple, their religion, numbers and power. What happened an hour ago by the lake was already dissolving in their minds. To them, it was just a small interruption, a messy pause in an otherwise perfect evening. They believed themselves untouchable, cushioned by wealth and arrogance, men above consequences. Then the phone rang. Not a cell phone. No. The old landline, the one they kept for official conversations. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Garrett answered sluggishly, half distracted, but I could hear his expression shift. Not from fear, never that, but from annoyance. "What hospital?" he said sharply. "ICU. What nonsense is this?" He listened, his lips curling into that familiar sneer. "Yes, I'm the husband's father. Got it." Then he slammed the receiver down. "What the hell was that?" Preston asked. "Your wife," Garrett replied, his tone dry. "Apparently she's in the hospital." "Looks like your mother-in-law took her theatrics a little too far." Preston grimaced, rubbing his temple as though it were just another headache to endure. This was ruining his evening, the drinks, the comfort, the illusion of control. He despised problems. Creating them was easy. Solving them bored him. The alcohol's warmth had already faded, leaving only irritation and that sticky fog of frustration. He scrolled through his phone, found the contact, "My sweetheart," and called. I was sitting in the icy corridor of the emergency room when the phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. The name glowed on the screen. My sweetheart. What a cruel, mocking phrase. I let it ring once before answering. "Hello," Preston's voice came through, calm, lazy, completely untouched by guilt. "Sweetheart, where are you? What did your mother do now?" "They called my dad and scared him half to death." I said nothing. I just let him talk, his arrogance spilling through every word. "Sweetheart, are you listening? Stop sulking and come home. We got carried away. It happens. You'll see. Everything's fine." Then I spoke. My voice was soft, steady, like the lake's surface after the storm. "She's alive." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, he was speechless. "Eleanor Hayes," he finally said, his voice lower now. "Where's Lena? Put her on." "Don't come here," I answered just as quietly. Then I hung up. The hospital corridor hummed with distant machines. The air smelled of bleach and exhaustion. People passed by in muted motion. Nurses, patients, whispers. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. 1 hour passed, then another. Finally, the doctor appeared. Young, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "Serious but stable," he said softly. "Concussion, hypothermia, water in the lungs. But she'll live." She would live. The words didn't bring comfort. They brought clarity. The kind of clarity that burns away hesitation. She would live. And that meant everything I needed to do was justified. They let me see her for 5 minutes. She looked impossibly small beneath the hospital lights, pale, fragile, wrapped in cables and wires that kept her breathing. A white bandage circled her head, and beneath it, a dark red bloom had already begun to spread. I stood beside her, and for a moment, the world went silent. The love I felt didn't vanish. It merely retreated, replaced by something far older, something primal, an instinct sharper than fear, the will to protect, no matter the cost. When I stepped back into the corridor, a nurse called out, "Miss Hayes, you have a delivery." She pointed to a tall vase overflowing with white lilies, not flowers, a monument. Their heavy sweetness filled the hall like the scent of morning. Between the petals was an envelope, thick and expensive. I didn't need to open it to know who had sent it, but I did anyway. Inside, on embossed paper, was one line written in elegant calligraphy. "My dear, let's not let your mother's theatrics ruin our fun." I read it twice. Not a muscle in my face moved. I folded the note neatly and slid it into my pocket beside Lena's phone. It wasn't an apology. It was a message, no, a declaration. They regretted nothing. They still thought it was a performance, a play I'd staged to amuse myself. They still believed they were the directors, that I was just an actress in their script. They didn't realize the story had already changed hands. The script was mine now, and the roles they'd written for everyone, I had rewritten them. Completely. I turned to the nurse and nodded toward the lilies. "Please throw those away," I said softly. "My daughter is allergic to them." The nurse blinked, confused, but I was already walking away. The scent of the lilies trailing behind me like a promise. The nurse glanced at the extravagant bouquet, then at me, confusion and pity mingling in her eyes. She probably thought grief had snapped something inside me. I nodded faintly, and she walked away, leaving the corridor stripped of that screaming white arrangement. Without it, the hall looked emptier, even grayer, faceless, like grief itself. I spent the night on a hard plastic chair outside the ICU. I didn't sleep. I didn't pray. I didn't cry. I planned. The rhythmic hiss of oxygen and the distant echo of footsteps became my metronome. Behind that white door, my daughter fought for her life, and behind my silence, something else was stirring. A plan. A reckoning. Isaac was already moving. I knew it. That short, quiet call had been more than a plea for help. It was a signal. One he'd been waiting for, unknowingly, for years. Isaac Hayes, my brother. Once he had been the best investigative journalist in the country. A man who could smell lies like a wolf scents blood. He didn't interview. He dissected. He peeled back skin, bone, and pretense until truth screamed in the open. But his brilliance came with a flaw. He never stopped where others would. He pushed too far, tore too deep, and one day he cut the wrong vein. The story that ended him had the fingerprints of powerful men on it, and Gerrit Van Doren was one of them. Isaac was destroyed, branded unethical, stripped of credentials, exiled from every newsroom that once celebrated him. But he never softened. His edge only rusted with bitterness. For years he scraped by on ghostwriting and dark freelance work, writing under pseudonyms that sounded like ghosts from old pulp novels. But I knew his fire hadn't gone out, only buried, waiting for oxygen. And my call was oxygen. He wouldn't start with gossip or surface-level fights. That was beneath him. He'd go for the roots, the rot beneath the marble. He would dig into Gerrit Van Doren's past. Dawn came gray and trembling. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. A nurse handed me a paper cup, smiling faintly. "Good news," she said. "Your daughter's stable. She's conscious now." The words hit softly. Not joy, just confirmation. It wasn't a miracle. It was Lena's stubborn will. She'd always been a fighter. She'd just spent too long fighting on the wrong side. When I walked into her room, sunlight slanted across the bed, pale and gentle. She looked so small, her head turned toward the window, face ghostly white against the pillow. "Mom," she whispered. "I'm here, baby," I said, taking her hand. It was cold, fragile as paper. Her lips trembled. "Did he call Preston?" "Yes," I said, truth heavy on my tongue. "He sent flowers too." She tried to smile, but her voice cracked. What did he say?" There was a small, dying ember of hope in her eyes, one last spark that refused to believe. I looked at her, steady. "He said I was being dramatic." Her eyes filled. No sob, no outburst. Just a single tear sliding down her cheek, slow and glistening. That one tear carried everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, the slow unraveling of illusions. And in that moment, I saw it. The veil that had blinded her for years had been washed away by lake water. My daughter was beginning to see the truth. The phone rang later that afternoon. I'd stepped out to the hospital garden. Brittle benches, wilted roses, air thick with disinfectant and fatigue. The number was unknown. "Yes, this is Eleanor." Isaac's voice came through, rough, low, the sound of a man who hadn't slept. "I have something for you." He didn't waste time. He never did. "I found old archives," he said. 22 years ago, same lake, different boat. Garrett Van Doren and his partner, Malcolm Pierce. They went fishing. Only Van Doren came back. The cold that had taken root in me the night of the drowning deepened. Isaac continued, voice like gravel. "Van Doren claimed Pierce was drunk, fell overboard, hit the propeller. An accident. Case closed in a week. Too fast. I tracked down the detective in charge, Ron Healy, retired now. Keeps bees up in the Sierra foothills. I went to see him. I could hear the faint rasp of a match, Isaac lighting a cigarette. He fought me for a while, he said, but I can be persuasive." I knew what that meant. His persuasion broke people open like fragile shells. Eventually, he talked, said he was pressured from above. They gave him an envelope full of cash and a photo of his daughter, a college student. He signed everything, closed the case, said it's haunted him every night since. I felt my pulse throb slowly, a drumbeat of old rage. Isaac's voice dropped lower. "That's not all. Pierce had a son, 10 years old at the time. The father had left, no contact. The boy grew up hating him, works now as a mechanic in Oakland. He kept some of his father's letters written to Pierce's sister before the accident." Isaac paused, his tone sharpening. "In those letters, Pierce said Van Doren cheated him, stole almost everything. He was planning to go to the district attorney. A week later, he was dead. The wind moved through the hospital trees, dry leaves scraping across the pavement. The story had come full circle. The lake had already claimed one man. And I knew, in a cold and measured way, it wasn't finished. The letter said he accidentally drowned. I closed my eyes and felt something cold settle deeper into my bones. That vague unease I'd carry all those years whenever we were near the Van Dorens. The worry everyone else dismissed as my nervous temperament wasn't imagined. It was an animal warning, a primitive alarm that had kept whispering, "There is danger here." Suddenly the whisper became a bright bulb switched on in a dark room. The furniture, the traps, the sharp edges were all visible at once. "What now?" I asked into the thin autumn air, my voice level, steady. Now we have leverage, Isaac said without flourish. They think this is a family squabble. They don't know we're playing a different game. He was right. This was no longer a raw reaction born of pain. It was not the ragged primal revenge of an injured mother. It was something else, the deliberate assembling of truth, an attempt to restore an account that had been stolen from a man named Malcolm Pierce 22 years earlier. Where a body had sunk, a story had been buried. I felt suddenly authorized, not by anger alone, but by fact and by the weights of evidence beginning to stack. I sat on the bench in the hospital garden until the light thinned. The sun touched the bare branches but offered no warmth. My hands no longer trembled. They were steadier than they had been in years. I could feel a plan taking shape in the hollows of my palms. The next 2 days passed in the close, methodical fog of hospital routine. I made thin broth on a portable burner in Lena's room and helped her hobble to the bathroom when the nurse allowed it. We didn't talk much about what had happened. Conversation felt both inadequate and unnecessary. Instead, a new language grew between us. Small silences, glances that held judgments, the simple, heavy presence of someone finally understood. Lena stopped defending them. She stopped explaining and started listening. In her quiet, there was a condemnation more definite than any accusation I could make. Preston stopped calling altogether. He waited, as men like him always did, for the drama to dissolve of its own accord and for his wife to soothe the ripples back into place. He met problems with a soft fury he preferred to outsource. He assumed this too would fade. He was wrong. Outside his neat circle of control, clouds were gathering. On the third day, the pressure slid into motion. I imagine it like a scene in a play he'd always thought himself the lead of. Garrett Van Doren sat in his office, carved of dark oak and leather, a curated world of precision and silence. The morning market reports ticked along on the widescreen, numbers that bore the weight of fortunes. He moved with the easy confidence of a man with everything insured against surprise. To him, what happened at the pier was an annoyance. Preston's headache, a minor diversion. Then one of the private lines on his desk rang, the one he used for serious matters, the one without caller ID. He picked up, expecting a friendly voice, perhaps Mayor Dalton, a man of administration whom Garrett had helped more than once, a man who owed him favors and used his help like a debt paid. Instead, a precise, cool tone greeted him. Not pleasantries, not familiarity. A voice that cut. Garrett, we need to speak, not by phone. Garrett's face shifted. He didn't like being moved out of his rituals. Who is, he began. But there was no ease in the other voice. There was only business. A man had been at the Vandor house today, the caller said. He presented himself as a journalist, but the questions he asked were surgical. About boats, about money, about an argument the night before Malcolm Pierce's death. He had details, the caller insisted, details only a handful of people could have known. You, the detective Ron Healy, and the deceased. Something unwound in Garrett then. The room that felt vast, cut down to its proportions as if the walls leaned in. He listened while the caller spoke with measured firmness. I covered that story once, the voice said. I won't cover it again unless it's clean. My name must not be entangled in it. Do you understand me? The line went dead. Garrett sat motionless. The numbers on the screen continued to move as if nothing had changed. For the first time, the air around him felt thin. Across town, Isaac was not gentle in his methods. He had never been subtle in a way that comforted polite society, and yet his bluntness was effective. He had pulled a retired detective from the Sierra foothills, Detective Ron Healy, who had kept bees and secrets. He had made him remember. He'd found Malcolm Pierce's estranged son in Oakland, a mechanic with greasy hands and a box of letters. He'd unearthed a trail of pressure, of envelopes passed quietly, and of signatures bought with fear. Details came together like bones from the sea. Pierce had written about money stolen, about threats made the week before his death. Healy had been given an easy way out, a file to close, and a photograph to threaten. He signed because he was scared for his family. He had carried it like a stone for 22 years. The hospital corridor felt less like a place of repairs and more like a command center. Isaac's discoveries were not melodrama. They were documents, witnesses, connective tissue. They transformed a personal violation into a historical breach. Now the ledger could be balanced, not by spectacle, but by evidence. I waited, and Lena began to learn to look, to see neighbors and names, with the clarity of someone whose veil had finally been torn away. Her single tear in the hospital bed had been the thinnest of openings. Now a fissure widened into daylight. That night, as city lights blurred past the taxi window, I did not imagine punishments. I imagined an accounting, public records, sworn statements, the truth folded into files an honest system would read. I wanted them to know the weight of what they'd tried to dismiss as a joke. I wanted the past laid bare so it could no longer be used as a weapon. The work Isaac and I were doing was not theater. It was slow, procedural, and irrevocable. And in that quiet, deliberate place between fury and action, I understood that what I was aiming for was not vengeance, but restoration. To write a ledger, to make sure a man's silence did not drown another's life without consequence. The lake had taken one life before. The records and testimony we were assembling would make sure its truths could no longer be buried. The numbers on the screen blurred into chaos, meaningless lines and digits. Gerrit Van Doren blinked, but the confusion only deepened. His hands, the same hands that had shoved my daughter into the freezing lake, trembled. For the first time in years, he felt sweat gather on his palms. It wasn't guilt. It was realization, a slow, creeping horror seeping into his consciousness. His mind, trained to handle corporate warfare, blackmail, and backroom deals, couldn't process what was unfolding. Some journalist, an old case. A connection slithered toward him like a shadow he thought he'd buried decades ago. He snatched up the phone. "Preston," he barked. Minutes later, his son walked in. Lazy grin, cologne, a faint trace of whiskey. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, half distracted. Gerrit stared at him. For the first time, he didn't see his heir. He saw his weakness, the spoiled product of his empire. "Your mother-in-law," Gerrit said coldly. "Did she say anything? Threaten us?" Preston smirked. "The old woman. She'll cry a little, complain to Lena. That's all. She didn't even call anyone, just stood there yelling." And that's when Gerrit understood, slowly, painfully, like poison working its way through the veins. That calm, lifeless tone on the phone wasn't despair. It was control. A quiet signal. The kind only someone dangerous sends. The kind that ends legacies. He lunged to the window. The empire he built with fear, favors, and money now trembled beneath his feet. This wasn't a grieving mother. This was an executioner with a plan. The call she made from the shore hadn't been to the police. It was to the one man capable of burning him down. "She has a brother," Gerrit muttered. "Isaac Hayes, journalist." He froze, remembering. Ex-journalist. The name felt like a curse resurrected. Preston frowned, still clueless. He didn't understand that the grenade had already exploded, years ago, and the quiet old woman had just released the pin. Gerrit dialed number after number, summoning the people who once fed on his power. His voice, once commanding, now cracked. Orders turned to pleas. Threats met silence. The machine of control he had ruled for decades, gone. On the other end, polite voices, excuses, disconnections. One by one, the walls fell. The rats were escaping, cutting their ropes before the shit sank. Preston just stood there, pale, helpless, the smell of alcohol turning sour in the air. For the first time, he saw fear in his father's eyes. Not rage, not authority, fear. And far away I felt it, the shift. Like thunder rolling beneath calm skies. I didn't need to see it. I knew it had begun. The reckoning had started, moving with its own momentum. That day, Lena slept peacefully for the first time, her breath steady, her color returning. I sat beside her until the rhythm of her breathing matched the quiet in my chest. When she drifted off, I slipped out, walking through the dim corridors until I reached the hospital's forgotten wing, the old library. It smelled of dust and silence. My world. For 40 years, I had lived among order and words, each volume in its place, each truth preserved. In that stillness, I felt the storm outside breaking lives apart, and inside, for the first time, everything was finally in order. The hospital's forgotten library became my refuge, a small, dust-choked room where order still mattered. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the dim hush, high vaulted ceiling, sunbeams cutting through particles of dust, shelves bowed under the weight of unread lives. A central table sagged under a careless mountain of volumes, books left out of place and abandoned like stray thoughts. I set to work the way a surgeon sets to stitches, not out of duty, but because it steadied me. My fingers wiped the dust from covers, as if erasing fingerprints from a crime scene. I read spines like dossiers. Toni Morrison belonged beside Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker, sisters together. A battered medical manual climbed to the top shelf of technical literature. A Patterson thriller found its slot among popular fiction. Each book returned, eased something inside me. The chaos receded, the table cleared, the shelves accepted their burdens again. I moved slowly, deliberately, a quiet ritual. I didn't let my mind wander to Isaac, or to the Van Dorens, or even to Lena lying pale upstairs. The books were enough, a small human proof that misplaced things could be put back where they belonged. The act was its own redemption. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I wedged it between shoulder and ear and kept shelving. Isaac's voice came through, low and dark with controlled excitement. "He's thrashing like a caged animal," he reported. "Calling favors, trying to buy silence. Intimidating people. It's collapsing. His old allies are stepping away like they're ashamed." "Good," I said, settling a thick Baldwin into its place. "He'll know it's me. He'll know you're behind this." "He won't go quietly," Isaac warned. "He'll act. He'll lash out. Expect moves." "I'm careful," I replied, "but be ready." He laughed once, a sound like a match struck, then softened. "I haven't lived where I'm registered for years. Don't worry about me. You might need a lawyer soon." "Not yet," I said. "Keep digging." We hung up, and I picked up a children's book. The glossy cover was bright and incongruous among the dust. My hand traced the edge, and some small, old tenderness passed through me. The same tenderness that had once read these pages aloud to Lena. I felt no hatred in that room. The Van Dorens were no longer human in my eyes. They were objects arranged on a board, pieces I had nudged into motion. Their panic was not a spectacle I wanted to savor. In the library's hush, I worked simply to restore balance, in a tiny corner where quiet things could be corrected while the world outside unspooled. When the last book slid into place, a weary satisfaction settled over me. The room looked right. Harmony reigned between the stacks. I closed the door behind me and walked back into the antiseptic light of the hospital corridors. Across town, Garrett Van Doren's world unraveled faster than he could manage. His calls went unanswered. Old debts and favors dissolved into polite silence. The networks of influence he had built, contacts who once smelled of obligation, now smelled only of self-preservation. In panic, Garrett stripped the last layers of discretion from his actions. Desperation drives men to blunt instruments. He reached for what he knew best: force and intimidation. He called his head of security, a hulking ex-special forces type with a face carved from apathy and a willingness to do the dirty work no one else would touch. "Find the journalist," Garrett hissed. "Hayes, get his address. Make him understand he made a mistake. Make him forget his own name." The security chief nodded with the practiced vacancy of someone who'd carried out orders without asking questions. With access to certain databases and favors still lingering in shadowed corners, finding a man was not difficult. An hour later, 2 anonymous dark cars eased out of a nondescript garage and melted into the city's arteries, their passenger windows blacked out like the lids over guilty eyes. Inside, men waited, hands folded, faces set, the engines purring readiness. Garrett's empire, once a polished stage, had begun to operate in the margins, a private muscle, a last crude language for those who could no longer buy silence with checks and committee favors. Back in the library, I ran my fingers along the neat spines, breathing in the steady, paper-sweet air. Outside, the machinery of fear was moving, but inside, order had returned. The book I closed last was Chekhov, human, precise, merciless in its quiet truths. I set it on the shelf and for the first time in days, allowed myself a small, cool smile. Everything had a place again. Everything would be accounted for. Mom, don't forget me. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of everything that had happened in the past month. The chaos, the terror, the meticulously orchestrated justice. The Van Doren's empire had collapsed not with guns or threats, but with the quiet, precise method of truth exposed. The apartment that had once smelled of secrets and fear was now empty, silent. The boxes around me were all that remained of our life there. Memories packed, labeled, ready to move on. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight, small dancers in the quiet aftermath of storms. I ran my fingers over Lena's shaky handwriting again and felt a pang of something raw, fragile and real, hope. It had been a month since the lake, since the firestorm of revelations and the unraveling of an entire family's tyranny. Preston and Garrett Van Doren were gone from our lives, their names reduced to whispers of shame and scandal in the news feeds and courtrooms. Isaac had vanished too, leaving only the echo of his meticulous work and the evidence of justice served. I stepped back and looked at the empty living room. The walls, once oppressive with the memory of everything we had endured, now seemed to breathe again. Silence was no longer threatening. It was restorative. Every box, every labeled pile was a marker of survival, of reclaiming what had been stolen. The city outside moved on, unaware of the storm that had swept through it. But inside me, a storm had passed as well, replaced by clarity. I walked to the window and watched the streets below. People hurried past, caught in their routines, oblivious to the truth that had toppled a dynasty. The same truth that had taken my daughter from the brink of death and returned her to me, stronger, wiser, awake. I opened one of the boxes, pulling out old photographs. There was Lena as a first grader, eyes bright behind giant ribbons, her tiny hands clutching her first bouquet. There she was at graduation, beaming, the same hope in her eyes that had always made me believe in her. And there she was, days after the lake incident, recovering in the hospital. Fragile, yes, but alive. All of it reminded me why I had acted, why the calm, calculated fury had been necessary. I thought of the Van Dorns, stripped of their power, humiliated by the very truth they had ignored and trampled. It had been justice, precise and unstoppable. And yet, I felt no gloating, only peace. I knew the world could be cruel, but also that it could be corrected, if one had the patience, the courage, and the will. Lena had returned to school slowly, taking one cautious step at a time. I was there with her, silent but present, letting her discover her strength, her voice, and her autonomy again. Every day, we rebuilt the trust, the joy, and the warmth that had been stolen by others. And in the quiet moments, as we sipped tea in our small sunlit kitchen, I felt the weight lift, not fully gone, but manageable now. I closed the last box, sealing away a chapter of darkness, and placed it carefully by the wall. The room was empty, clean, and orderly. Harmony had returned to the apartment, to our lives, and to the world of my daughter. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. For the first time in decades, I felt certain that we had won. Not through brute force, not through chaos, but through patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. And as I looked at Lena's note one last time, I whispered quietly, more to myself than anyone else, "We are free, finally free." The room smells faintly of cardboard and dust. Sunlight streaks across the floor, catching particles in slow dance. Empty boxes are stacked neatly along the walls. Silence reigns, heavy but comforting. Eleanor, V.O. Books, handle with care. Lena sits on the windowsill, hugging her knees, gazing out at the bustling, indifferent city. Her face is familiar. Slender, fair, serious eyes, but something has shifted. Gone is the desperate effort to please, the fear. In its place rests quiet, slightly melancholic wisdom. Eleanor carefully wraps Lena's favorite mug, sets aside her newspaper. Lena nods, a soft smile of acknowledgement. They work in silence, each movement weighted with meaning. A photograph of the two of them in the park, a gentle, fleeting smile. Packing isn't just packing. It's clearing debris, separating what belongs in the past from what will accompany them forward. Eleanor O.P., this month has changed her more than 10 years ever did. Outside the window, the city moves on. Inside, the aftermath of justice and revelation has settled. The story Isaac published hit like a bomb. Criminal investigations ignited. Attempted murder charges, reopening of the 22-year-old Lake case. Garrett and Preston Van Doren arrested. The empire they built on fear and money crumbled to dust. Partners turned away. Accounts frozen. Eleanor doesn't follow the news. She doesn't need to. Their war ended the moment Isaac pressed publish. Everything else is merely consequence. Cut. Lena, quietly strong, files for divorce. Eleanor watches. Preston's remorseful letters arrive from jail. Lena tears them up silently. Her faith now lies in actions, not words. The last box is taped shut. The chapter is closed. Weena, where are we going now? Her voice is soft, hesitant, like emerging from darkness into light. Eleanor pulls a small set of keys from her pocket. The silver book charm gleams faintly in the sun. Eleanor, I bought back our old apartment. 2-bedroom near the public library. Remember? Lena's eyes widen. Surprise, then quiet joy. The apartment, Old brick, creaking hardwood floors, high ceilings, huge window overlooking a quiet courtyard. Their old home, the place they were happy. A place Eleanor had sold years ago to help with Lena's marriage. Now reclaimed. Keys in Lena's palm, a promise, walls standing, stories waiting. Eleanor, it's time to write the ending. Lena squeezes the keys. Genuine smile, unforced, pure. Lena, yes, Mom. It's time. They leave. Door closes behind them. Keys left in the lock, no longer needed. Down the stairs. Outside, moving truck and Eleanor's old taxi. Eleanor drives. Lena rides shotgun. The city glows in the evening sun. Eleanor, voiceover. For the first time in years, I feel no fear. Freedom isn't that my enemies were punished. Freedom is her safety. Freedom is this small apartment near the library where unfinished stories and unread books wait for their moment. Passing houses blur in the golden light. The evening sky reflects in Lena's eyes. Eleanor, VO. We have time ahead of us. The story of Eleanor ends here, a tale of quiet strength, a mother's love and justice that didn't need a courtroom, only a single, calculated action. Where is the line between revenge and restoring order, between forgiveness and impunity? Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't beg the consciences that had none. She chose a path of cold precision, and in the end, it was the only path that worked. Did she act correctly? Could she have trusted a system that failed once before? Or was her action the only response to absolute evil, hiding behind a mask of respectability? What happens to Garrett and Preston now? Can Lena truly start over, free from the shadows of the past? And Eleanor herself, what did she feel in those key moments? Write your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss this story together. If it touched you, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share your opinion. Creating these stories, with research and preparation, takes time and effort. Your support helps us continue telling stories like Eleanor's. Every like, share, and donation directly contributes to bringing new, captivating stories to life. Did you enjoy this story? Which city are you watching from? Let's meet in the comments. And don't forget to check out the 2 recommended life stories on the screen. Subscribe to catch more. With love and respect, see you in the next story.